Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining today and happy ADHD Awareness Month. This webinar is the first in a little series that I'm going to put together about neurodivergence, mental health. Over the coming sessions, we're going to do things like explore ADHD, autism, anxiety, different strategies to support neurodivergent individuals across different settings. Today we're specifically focusing on ADHD. So what it is, how it shows up, and practical ways to support it. So try to get a little bit more understanding around that. Hopefully I leave you with some useful insights that you can apply right away. One thing to keep in mind as well is that at the end of this webinar, there will be a link to a Google form where you can leave anonymous, de-identified questions. Please feel free, it's very encouraged to leave a question, and hopefully we can get to it in a future webinar. Before we dive right into ADHD, I just want to quickly tell you a little bit about Ascension Psychology and why we do what we do. So across, schools, clinics, the disability sector, we have noticed something really important, and it's that traditional therapy can often feel quite clinical or really intimidating, and people leave feeling like their experiences aren't fully understood. So at Ascension, we try to do things a little bit differently. Our focus is on supporting neurodivergent individuals, so autistic people, ADHDers, other neurological differences, in a way that feels human. So that means creating like a safe, relaxed, judgment-free space where you can be yourself. We also believe that, mental health shouldn't come with shame. Your brain works differently, and that difference is just part of human diversity, so it's not really a flaw. Our goal at Ascension is to help people navigate different challenges, embrace their strengths, and build strategies that work for them and not against them. So if you've ever felt misunderstood in traditional mental health spaces or worried about therapy feeling like it's too clinical, maybe that's maybe would be helpful for you. Now I just want to do a quick meet the team moment. We like to keep things pretty fun and approachable here. We like to bring things like warmth, humor, and understanding into our work. That's me right here, mega nerd of assessments at Ascension. Something to keep in mind is that we all understand that therapy doesn't have to feel intimidating. It can feel very human as well. So, getting into it, what is ADHD? Simply put, it's a neurodevelopmental condition. So that means it's a difference in how the brain develops and it works. People who are ADHDers often show traits of inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity, and sometimes it's a mix of all three. So inattention might look like forgetting things, getting distracted easily, struggling to start or finish tasks, daydreaming, or having trouble staying organized. And hyperactivity and impulsivity can show up as constant fidgeting, trouble sitting still, talking a lot, having racing thoughts, or needing to keep busy. One important thing to remember is that ADHD can look different for everyone. So some people can be mostly inattentive, some people are very they have a lot of high energy levels, and some people have a mix. And there's different ways in how that inattention and hyperactivity can show up. Another way to think about it is your brain has a lot of tabs open at once. Sometimes the tabs switch too quickly. Sometimes you get stuck on one thing, and that can make focusing or organizing your day quite tricky. Something that we'll get a little bit more into in a second is that it's not just about the challenges. A lot of ADHD brains are also very capable of a lot of different things like creativity, curiosity, energy, problem solving, and understanding how the brain works helps us to support those strengths while managing the more tricky parts of ADHD. One thing that can make ADHD tricky to understand for some is that many of the traits can overlap with other conditions or brain types, and that's why sometimes it can be hard to know what's ADHD and what might be something else. So for example, anxiety can also look like restlessness, fidgeting, trouble concentrating, sleep challenges, racing thoughts, irritability. Some of these are very similar to ADHD traits, so it can be a little bit confusing. Autistic traits can have a bit of overlap as well. So things like sensory sensitivities. So while autistic individuals have a bigger internal reaction to sensory input, ADHD individuals can also experience that as well, but it's more like tuning into those like sounds and things that are happening around you. Difficulty with transitions as well, hyperfocus on interests. I don't know about anyone else who's watching this as an ADHDer. Something that I very commonly refer to as the ADHD hobby basket. So a lot of ADHDers can very intensely focus on an activity for a few weeks, a month or so, and then they put it down and move on to something else. So that really intense interest almost in bursts. Challenges with executive functioning, so planning, switching tasks is something that autistic individuals also experience as well. And then also specific learning disabilities, so like dyslexia, dyscalculia, which might show up in also in young people, like slow work completion. Frustration with reading or writing is something that a lot of ADHDers also experience. So those kind of bigger tasks that require a lot more structure, but also when you're like writing an essay, for example, but also things like reading. So if you find that like you're constantly like skipping over text, it's more an ADHD trait, whereas actually working out like the word sounds is more a dyslexia trait. Also, challenges with keeping up with schoolwork. The important takeaway here is that overlap is normal. So for example, a lot of ADHDers also experience anxiety, so the overlap is expected. And that's why professional assessment is really helpful, because it helps identify what is ADHD, what might be something else, and how best to support that individual. I just wanted to take a moment to take a peek inside an ADHD brain, so what's actually happening that makes attention, focus, and activity feel quite different when you have an ADHD brain. So in ADHD, the brain networks that control things like attention, planning, impulse control, they work quite differently. And a key part of that is dopamine. So that dopamine helps us with focus and motivation, and it's regulated quite differently in ADHD brains. So if we come back to, might use a different analogy actually. So you can think of your brain as a TV with like a lot of channels, switching really fast, or maybe there's a traffic jam in the thinking part of your brain. So sometimes your thoughts get stuck, but other times they can zoom around uncontrollably in the most simple of terms. I also wanted to take a moment to tackle some common myths about ADHD, because there is so much misinformation out there. The first one, and probably the biggest one, is that ADHDers can't concentrate at all. People with ADHD can actually concentrate really well, but it's usually only when they are interested in the activity. So say, for example, I can concentrate really well when I'm talking about like assessments, because that's something of huge interest to me and I can almost like fixate on it really intensely. So it's not necessarily about laziness, it's just about what's actually grabbing your attention. The next one is that ADHD is being overdiagnosed. This is something that you've probably heard a lot about recently. The reason that diagnoses are rising is mostly because we're getting a lot better at recognizing ADHD, especially in people who internalize it. So when I say internalize, I mean that more kind of presentation of ADHD that's on the inside. So feeling internally restless, feeling like, oh, you really want to get up and move around, but societal pressure says we need to stay seated for this meeting, in this class, we need to stay seated and listen. So you get a lot better at hiding that you want to get up and move around. Also, masking can come out when with the inattentive side of ADHD as well, like pretending that you've heard what someone said and just kind of nodding along and going, yep, I hear you, and then later having to kind of scramble to work out what it was that they actually said to you. So those are kind of the more internalized experiences, so less outwardly obvious, but they're going on the inside. And that can look like, those quiet or inattentive kids at school, for example. They might be sitting in the class not causing any trouble, but on the inside they're actually experiencing a lot of challenge related to ADHD. Speaking about kids, so another one is that ADHD is just for kids. The reason we associate ADHD as a childhood condition is because it is neurodevelopmental, meaning one of the requirements for a diagnosis is that it has to be present in childhood. That being said, ADHD is not just for kids, it is lifelong, and it can look very different in adults than it does in children. So adults might struggle with things like organization, time management, emotional regulation, so it can just present a little bit differently. Another one is that girls and women don't experience the hyperactive side of ADHD. It does present very differently in females than in men, but it shows up in less obvious ways. So the way it may show up more in girls and women is like constant talking, internal restlessness, multitasking. So it's not always just about that classic fidgeting that you might expect. It might not be, the young person that's like running around the classroom at school or running around the office at work. It's just that kind of more subtle presentation of hyperactivity and impulsivity. Now, I just want to flip the lens for a minute and have a look at ADHD strengths, because it is not all about challenges. I've popped a couple of kind of like infographics, I guess you could call them, in here. These are two very good Instagram accounts. I think Jessie J. Anderson's handle has changed on Instagram, so I do need to double check that. I'll pop them somewhere in this video to check out. But I think the iceberg picture is a perfect example of what we think about when we think about ADHD strengths versus what's actually going on. You can see there's actually a lot of diversity of different ADHD strengths, different strengths that ADHDers can have. So things like mastering new hobbies quickly, imagination, creativity is something that you think about a lot when you think about ADHD strengths. A lot of people don't actually think about the hyperfocus side of ADHD. So as I mentioned, for example, me, when I'm talking about assessments, I can hyperfocus pretty intensely and spend a long time doing it, so much so that I kind of tune out everything else that's going on. So that's a really useful strength, and it's something to kind of lean on. Getting a lot done in a short amount of time. So again, that hyper focus can really help with that. Always like a big burst of energy, which is why it's really helpful to schedule like work that you need to do at a time when you feel that burst of energy. So almost leaning into the way that your brain works rather than trying to fit a box of the way that you should be doing things, which is leading me into the next infographic, which is that it is helpful to society and to the world to have different brain types. Otherwise, things would be very stagnant, things would not change. ADHDs have brain types that are more creative, probably problem solve a little bit better and great at brainstorming and working under like intense time pressure conditions. Having those strengths creates diversity in the world, which is beneficial to society, really. So how do you know if it might be time to seek an assessment? So coming back to, it might be helpful to go back to that slide where I talked about different signs of like inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. How do you know when it's time to seek an assessment? Well, if you're experiencing a lot of those traits and you've experienced them since childhood, that might be a sign that it's time to get an assessment. If you are a parent watching this, maybe you notice a few of these challenges with your child. So those are the first kind of the starting point. A lot of people get a bit tripped up when it comes to actually seeking the assessment and knowing where to go, understanding what type of professional should be doing an assessment for you. There are a couple of key differences, and I'm going to split it between what we call like the medical intervention and what we would call more like behavioral intervention, if that makes sense. So when I talk about medical intervention, it is medicine, because a lot of people want to seek medical support for ADHD traits, and that's in the form of stimulants. So a lot of people want to go to a doctor and get prescribed medication to help them with focusing and things like that. If that was your priority and that was your goal, you would go down the pathway of going to a pediatrician if you're under 18 or a psychiatrist if you're over 18. If your goal was more self-understanding and you're wanting support with whatever challenges are coming up, which I'll get to in a moment, you might want to go to see a psychologist instead. But again, if you were wanting the medical intervention, you would go to a psychiatrist or pediatrician as your first starting point, because they are able to immediately prescribe, whereas if you were to go to a psychologist, you might have to get, especially if you're over 18, you might have to get a reassessment through a psychiatrist if you want to access medication. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind, is what is the end goal that I want to get out of this assessment? Do I just want to know myself better, or do I want like medical help, basically? If you are under 18, your school can also really help with talking you through like referral pathways and things like that. So if you have like a teacher that you want to talk to, if your young person has a teacher that you think might be able to help with talking about referral options and things like that, definitely check in with them first. There's definitely some benefits to assessment, as you can see here. So it gives a little bit of clarity about what's going on. It validates your experiences. It helps with, if we're thinking about like families, access to supports at school. If you're over 18, access to supports at work. So maybe you need some accommodations. Maybe you need to start understanding how you can work in a way that works for your brain type specifically. If you were to get, say, like a psychologist assessment, you get tailored strategies for things like helping you with attention, organization, emotional regulation. It can also help, there's been a few studies about how early recognition can help prevent what we call like secondary challenges, so things like anxiety, frustration, low self-esteem, all things that can pop up. A lot of people struggle with the idea of, I guess, getting slapped with a label. The thing I would say to that is that you got to think about whether the benefits outweigh the kind of cons of the label. So the benefits of having a label is that we can work out what type of support you need. You know, ADHD is very well studied and researched, so we have a very specific evidence-based pathway for support for ADHD brains. So understanding that you have an ADHD brain can be quite beneficial in terms of working out what type of support you need. And coming to that, so there are a pretty broad range of ways that ADHD brains can be supported, and something very important to keep in mind is that every HDer has their own specific challenges. So it might be that some of these things you don't struggle with, and some of these things you might struggle with a bit more. And there might be things on here that you don't even struggle with that you might benefit from getting some support with. One of the main ones that ADHDers want support with is what's called executive functioning, which is like your brain's control center. So it helps you start things, it helps you stop things. It, like, for example, resisting impulses is that kind of stop button. Moving between tasks, regulating like emotional responses, but also, like starting tasks, planning tasks, making sure you kind of get them done. So it helps you stay kind of on track with starting and stopping things, essentially. So that might be something that you want support with in terms of environmental strategies that you can try at home. Another one is tools for noticing, like managing big emotions. So also working on things like rejection sensitivity, something that a lot of ADHDers experience. When I say rejection sensitivity, a lot of ADHDers experience I guess more of an intense response to like criticism, rejection, and that's because the ADHDers are much more, they experience a lot more, I guess, criticism throughout their life. So from teachers, from parents, constantly being told like they're doing things wrong, that they're not paying attention, that they need to sit down, be quiet. When you experience a lot of that throughout your life, it can have an adverse impact on how you respond to that criticism. Also, things like tolerating frustration as well is something that you could work on and get support with. Learning sustainable work rest patterns. So recognizing when you're overstimulated, when you're understimulated, and working out what you need to do to support yourself in that. If you're overstimulated, maybe you need to be in a quieter space, for example. If you're understimulated, maybe you need a bit of support with, kind of getting that energy out. So if you need to work out ways that you can incorporate like fidgets into your life or things like that, working out strategies for consistently regulating that energy throughout the day is something that you could work on someone with. Another one that comes up a lot for ADHD is self-compassion. So I'm doing years and years of, messaging that you're lazy, you're careless, you're not living up to your potential, is something that takes a while to work through. You can also get support with like conflict repair, building trust with others when, your ADHD like communication style, if you have a tendency to like talk over other people, talk quite a bit, maybe that has an impact on your relationships. So navigating that is something you could also benefit from support with. As I mentioned, like environmental scaffolds, so things like reminders, visual aids, checklists, phone alarms, trialing what works, getting advice and support around that. If you are in primary school or like high school, or maybe even if you're studying in university, maybe you need some support with study strategies that fit an ADHD learning style. So things like spaced repetition, interest-based learning. Another thing that I didn't put on here is career coaching. So finding work that aligns with your strengths, and also getting support with managing challenges that come up at work, like deadlines. One thing I like to do in my assessments is leave like parents, clients with some resources that I personally find really useful. So books, workbooks, guides that explain neurodivergence, ADHD in relatable ways, in understandable ways. So books that are really accessible. These are just some of my favorites. This is not an exhaustive list of books that I've loved. So The Year I Met My Brain by Matilda Bosley is like a personal reflective story about understanding ADHD, learning to like live in a way that aligns with an ADHD brain, I guess you could say. Different Not Less by Chloe Hayden is really great for understanding neurodivergence, specifically like autism, ADHD, from a lived experience perspective. Nurturing Neurodivergence by Jasmine Liu is a guide to like building healthy relationships with yourself, with others when you've received a diagnosis in adulthood. Laziness Does Not Exist is really great for like reframing productivity and motivation. So it's really helpful in kind of teaching yourself about self-compassion and how to work in a way that supports yourself. And finally, the Neurodivergent Friendly Workbook of DBT Skills by Sunny Jane Wise, which is like hands-on skills for emotional regulation and coping. As we wrap up, let's just go over some key takeaways from today. So the main one important one is that ADHD is a brain difference, so it's not really a character flaw. It's not about laziness, being difficult. ADHD can look really different across different ages, different genders. So what you may see in a child may not be the same as in a teenager or an adult, and it can present very differently in boys, girls, and women. Support's needed to be tailored to the individual, so one size does not fit all. Recognition can improve outcomes. So understanding ADHD as early as you can help things like preventing frustration, anxiety, low self-esteem. Supports and strategies can make a huge difference. So simple adjustments at home, school, or work can help ADHD brains thrive. Every ADHD has unique strengths. So if we come back to that iceberg, like creativity, curiosity, problem solving, high levels of energy are just a few examples. And the main takeaway is that with the right support, people who are ADHDers can absolutely thrive. This is a very short webinar, and it would take me a very long time to go through everything that I know about ADHD. So if you have any more questions, that's totally understandable. If you want to leave a question that you want me to discuss in the future, you can leave it at the link that's on the screen now. One very important thing is that you don't leave any identifying information, because we do not want to be discussing specific people in this webinar, but if you do leave a question, we can try to address it in the future. If you want more personalized advice or support, you can book in a session with one of the clinicians. If you want to go back to the slide that we had earlier about the different clinicians we have here, you're more than welcome to. You can also contact our admin team at that email address to check who has any availability. But that's it. I hope today has been helpful. Again, if you have any more questions, you can leave it at the link, and look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Bye.